Search and Rescue, Part 1, by Kerry, Hammond. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'd share them here. I've been an SAR officer for a few years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good... I'm just going to press pause right here to just remember the one really important thing. This deals with suicide, and there's child death in there as well. Nothing is overtly gory in these two parts, but if you want to bail out, we will understand completely. And with that said, back to our show. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time they just wander off the path, or slip down a small cliff and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old stay where you are thing, and they don't wander far. But I've had two cases where that didn't happen, and both bother me a lot, and I use them as motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. Now, we found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that he'd been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man, and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched the area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other one was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she had just never come back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and again, we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone, because neither her mother or her grandpa saw her come down. A few times I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and they have tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces, straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine has led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. There was this one particularly sad case that involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. Complete freak accident, but I will never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I have ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died along with her daughter. I heard from another SAR officer she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss. A while after that, I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we'd received reports of bears. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some pretty serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We found him, trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg, and it was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was very obviously infected. Now, we were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he'd gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just nothing, just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he'd fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible, muffled screams. That one bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I've ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out late at night, and all the way through the night, because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotted log. She was missing her shoes and pack, and she was clearly in shock, and she didn't have any injuries. And we were able to get her to walk with us back to base ops, and along the way, she kept looking behind us. She kept asking why that big man with black eyes was following us. Now, we couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock, but the closer we got to base, the more agitated she got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she said, and she wasn't going to give us to him either. Now, we finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic, deeper. It was almost insect-like. Yeah, I genuinely don't know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of base ops, she turns to me, and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them, and she touches my shoulder and says, "He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." Now, I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman saw it. And right after she says it, I hear that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say, I was really happy when we left that night. This is the last one I'll tell for now, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point we've all gotten so used to it, it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, and I'm talking 30 or 40 miles here, at some point we will find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs in your house, cut them out, and put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing, and I wanted to go check them out, but I was told, very emphatically, that I should never go near any of them. I just kind of ignore them now when I run into them, because it happens so very, very frequently. I have a lot more stories, and I suppose if anyone's interested, I'll tell some of them tomorrow. If anyone has any theories about the stairs, or if you've seen them too, let me know. Part 2. So I logged back on tonight, and I was blown away by the staggering amount of interest this seems to have generated. First off, I'll address a few things that you guys have brought up. There have been an overwhelming amount of people mentioning the similarity between some of my stories and those of David Paulides. I assure you, I'm not trying to rip him off in any way. I've got nothing but respect for the dude. He's actually what inspired me to write this, because I can verify a lot of the things he talks about. We do have a lot of these strange missing persons cases, and most of the time, they aren't solved. Either that, or we find them in places they have no business being. I personally haven't been on many calls like that, but I'll share a few that I've seen, and a story my friend told me that relates to this. Also, there was a lot of feedback about the stairs, so I'll touch on that briefly here, and I'll also include a story. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and conditions. Some are pretty dilapidated, just ruins, but others are brand new. I saw one set, I swear, it looked like they'd come from a lighthouse. They were metal and spiral, almost old-fashioned. They don't go up infinitely, but they do go up farther than I can see. Some sets are taller than others. Like I said before, just imagine the stairs in your house as if someone cut and pasted them in the middle of nowhere. I don't have any pictures. It's never really occurred to me to try again after the first time, and I don't really feel like risking my job over it. I will try again in the future, but I can't promise anything. Oh, one last thing. A few people expressed confusion about the guy who ran into the man with no face. Just to clarify, when the climber ascended and reached the top of this peak, he saw another man in a parka and ski pants. This was the man with no face, not the climber. Sorry about the confusing wording of that story. I'll try to avoid it in the future. Now, on to the new stuff. As far as missing persons go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The others are rescue calls. People who fall down cliffs and hurt themselves, get injured by fire. You wouldn't believe how often this happens. Almost always drunk kids. Get bitten or stung by animals or insects. Now, we're a tight team, and we have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. And that's what makes these cases where we never find any trace of them so frustrating. One in particular was really upsetting for all of us, because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and had suffered one out on the trail. Now, before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask about that kind of thing, because past a certain point, it doesn't matter. Someone is missing. It's my job to go find them. So, we went out in a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found signs that the guy had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering as much ground as possible. And suddenly, a call comes over the radio, telling us all to head back to the vet's location. Now, we book it back there because this usually means the missing person is injured, and we need a full team to get them out safely. We meet back up, and the vet is just standing at the base of a tree with his hands on the sides of his head. I ask my buddy what's going on, and all he does is point up into the branches of the tree. And there is a walking stick dangling from a branch 30 feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle had been looped over the branch, and it's just hanging there. There is no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see any other sign that he's still in the area. We call up into the tree, but it's obvious no one's in it. We're all just sort of left scratching our heads. We keep searching for the guy, but we never find him. We even bring our canines out, but they lose his scent long before this tree. Eventually, the search is called off, because there are other calls we have to attend to, and honestly, past a certain point, there's not much we can do. Guy's wife called us every day, for months, always asking if we'd found her husband. Same time, every day. Heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting for me. I think it was just the sheer improbability of it. That and the questions that were raised. How the hell did this guy's cane end up there? Did someone kill him and toss that up as some trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one from time to time. Missing kids are the worst. It doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy, and we always dread the ones we find deceased. It's not common, but it happens. David Paulides talks a lot about kid SAR teams, And David Paulides talks a lot about kids, SAR teams finding places they shouldn't or couldn't be. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it. But I will share one of the ones that I think about a lot, and I witnessed this one personally. A mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, the other is about 3. She's watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never lets them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in the area, and that's important. She packs their stuff up, and they start to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a really clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost getting from that parking lot to that lake, unless you are deliberately going off the path like an imbecile. Her kids are walking in front of her, and she hears what sounds like someone coming up the path behind her. She turns around, and in the 4 or so seconds she's not looking, her 5-year-old vanishes. She figures he stepped off the trail to pee or something, and she asks her other 2 where he went. And they both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and led him into the trees. The 2 remaining kids aren't even upset. In fact, she says later that it seems like they've been drugged. They're kind of spacey, fuzzy. So of course she freaks out, starts looking frantically in the area for her kid. She's screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer her. Now obviously she can't go blindly running into the woods. She's got the other 2 kids. So she calls the police, and they send us out immediately. We respond, we start the search, and over the course of this search we span miles. We never find a single trace of him, not one. Canines can't pick up any scent, we don't find any clothing, no broken bushes, literally anything that would signify a child being there. Of course there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear she's just destroyed by this whole thing. We looked for that kid for weeks, with a lot of volunteer help. But eventually the search peters out, and we have to move on. The volunteers keep searching though, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body has been found and needs to be recovered. They tell us the location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid, but we go out there about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I have been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I have never come up with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the area because he figured he might as well look in places no one else would think to, on the off chance the body had been dumped. He comes to the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looks through his binoculars, and sure enough, it's the body of a little boy, stuffed in a little opening in the rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy, and that's when he calls it in, and we're dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he'd started, there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. This slope is treacherous. It's hard for us even with climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there. Of that, I'm certain. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty. So it wasn't as if an animal had dragged him up there. And from what we can tell, he hasn't even been dead that long. He'd been out there over a month by this point, and it looked like he'd been out dead for at most a day, maybe 2. The whole thing was just unbelievably strange, and was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death, probably late at night, 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects, and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I have ever seen. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mom. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him, because the dogs were on a strong scent trail and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch, about half a mile from where he'd been last seen. Kid wasn't even aware he'd wandered that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for, because I'm really not good with kids. I find it hard to talk to them, keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me one of the hot spots where we tend to find missing people. It's this natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. So we hike out there, it's a few miles away, and we get there in about an hour or so. As we're walking around the area, and she's pointing out places she's found people in the past, I see something off in the distance. Now, this area we're in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, though there's back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we're on state protected land, and that means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out here. The most you'll see is a fire tower or makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with building. But I can see from here that whatever this thing is has straight edges, and if there is one thing you learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I point it out. She doesn't say anything. She just hangs back, lets me wander over and check it out. So I get within 20 feet of it, and all the hair on the back of my neck stands up. It's a staircase. In the middle of the fucking woods, it's a staircase. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase. The carpet is beige. The thing's about 10 steps tall, but instead of being in a house, where it obviously should be, it's out here in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, and I can see the wood it's made from. How can I put this? It's like a video game. It's like my brain is working overtime to try and make sense of what I'm seeing. Now, my trainer comes and stands next to me, and she just stands there casually, looking at it as if it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her, not unreasonably, just what the fuck this thing is doing here? And she just chuckles. You gotta get used to it, rookie. You're gonna see a lot of them. I start to move closer. She grabs my arm. You're gonna see them all the time. But don't go near them. Don't touch them. Don't go up them. Just ignore them. I start to ask her about it, but there is something in the way she's looking at me that tells me it is best if I do not. We end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right, though. I'd say about every 5th call I go on, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, maybe within 2-3 miles. Sometimes they're 20-30 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere, and I only find them during the broadest searches or training weekends. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes it looks like they've been out there for a very long time. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like they came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion and were at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up at least 15 or 20 feet. I've tried talking about it with people, but they just give me the same response my trainer did. It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal. Don't go close to them. Don't go up them. When trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I don't know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I get a better answer. But it hasn't happened yet. This is another one that was less spooky and more sad. A young man went missing late in winter, when realistically no one should be going that far out onto the trails. We close a lot of them, but some remain open year-round unless there's a shitload of snow. We did not for him, but we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground. It was unusually heavy that year, and we knew it wasn't likely we'd find him until spring, when the thaw came through. Sure enough, when the first big thaw came, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree, in a pile of melted snow. I knew right away what had happened, and it scared the shit out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard or spend any amount of time on a mountain will probably have guessed too. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in the areas beneath the branches. Happens most with fir trees because they have this kind of closed umbrella shape. So what you end up with is a space around the base of a tree that's filled with a mixture of loose powdery snow, air, and branches. They're called tree wells, and they're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. We put up signs in the Welcome Centre, big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are, but every year that we get an unusual amount of snow, there is always at least one person that doesn't read them. And we find them in the spring. My best guess is that this young man was hiking and got tired, or maybe a cramp from walking in the deep snow. He went to go sit at the base of the tree, not knowing that there was a tree well, and fell in. He got stuck with his feet up, and the surrounding snow caved in around him, and unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion suffocation, and it doesn't usually happen, except in really deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position, like this poor guy did, even 6 feet of snow is going to be lethal. What scared me the most was imagining how he must have struggled. Upside down in the freezing cold, he did not die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him, and it would have been literally impossible to get out. As it got harder to breathe, he would have known what was happening, and I do not want to imagine what he was thinking in his last moments. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the Goatman while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, I've never had anything quite like that happen. I guess the closest was the whole black-eyed man thing, but I didn't see anything. However, there was one call where I had something kind of similar happen, but I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to the goat man. We'd gotten a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back down to the main area. So we hike up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside himself. He runs, well, I guess more jogs, to us and tells us that he was a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife starts screaming behind him. He runs back to her and she's passed out on the trail. We got her on a backboard, and as we're getting her down to the Welcome Centre, she comes to and she starts screaming all over again. I calm her down and ask what happened. I can't remember verbatim what she said, but essentially what happened was this. She'd been waiting for her husband when she started hearing this really strange sound. She said it sounded sort of like a cat, but it was off somehow, and she couldn't quite figure out why. She went a little ahead to try and hear it better, and it sounded like it was coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy she was, until she finally figured out what was wrong. Now, I remember this next part because it was so weird, I don't think I could forget it if I tried. It wasn't a cat. It was a man, saying the word meow over and over, just meow, meow, meow. But it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it and it still sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him, and the closer he got, the more scared I was, and the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees, and I think that's when I fainted. Now, obviously, I'm a little perplexed as to why a guy would be out in the fucking woods chanting meow, meow at people. So once we get down the mountain, I tell my superior that I'm going to go search the area to see if I can find anything. He gives me the go-ahead, I grab a radio, and I hike back to where she fainted. I don't see anyone, so I keep going about a mile more, and when I head back, I go off the trail to see if I can figure out where she saw him coming from. It's almost sunset by this point, and I don't have any desire to be out at night alone, so I just sort of write it off and make a mental note to check it out again tomorrow. And as I'm headed back, I start to hear something in the distance. I stop, and I call out for anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. The sound didn't come closer or get louder, but it sounded exactly like a man saying meow in this really odd monotone. As comical as it makes it sound, it was almost like the guy on South Park with the electrolarynx. I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get closer. It's almost like it's coming from all directions. Eventually, it just sort of fades out, and I ended up going back to the welcome centre. I didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back to that area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been some stupid kid out there fucking with people, but even I have to admit it was weird. So, this kind of turned into a massive wall of text, and for that, I apologise. I wanted to get to the stories my friend told me, and he does have some good ones, so I'll post those next time. I also have a few more of my own I think you guys will like. I'm sorry to keep you all in suspense again. Hopefully the stories here make up for it and help you get through the next little bit before I can post again. Edit. Since it seems like all of you would like to hear more, what I'll do next time is write up as many stories as I can and do a massive post. I'll include my friends' stories, and I'll see if I can't get a hold of a few more people who might have interesting things to talk about. I just wasn't sure how people felt about big, huge walls of text, but if you're all okay with it, I'll post it. See you next time. And that's the end of part 2, folks.